CHF International and the Rockefeller Foundation in anticipation of the 5th World Urban Forum, which is in about a month, and in less than a month. It'll begin in Rio. The series has been organized around themes of the World Urban Forum. Past seminars have examined cultural diversity and identity, governance and participation, equal access to urban land and shelter, and the right to the city bridging the urban divide. Today we'll be looking at inclusive, sustainable urbanization. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Blair Rubel. I'm here with the Wilson Center, and on behalf of the Wilson Center, I want to welcome you, and I want to welcome and thank our Wilson Center colleagues, Lauren Herzer and Allison Garland. But mainly, I want to thank and welcome our colleagues from CHF and Matthew Chandy, who will chair the session. He's been a really good partner in all of these meetings, and this really would not have happened without really the primary support of CHF, and of course the financial backing of our friends at Rockefeller, but CHF did a lot of the heavy lifting. So I wanted, in turning the floor over to Matthew, the chair, I just wanted to thank you again and all of your colleagues for everything that you've done.
Thank you, Blair, and apologize that Steve Weir is probably running late. Hopefully by the time Judy and Chris have their time speaking, he comes in. We also were planning to have Esther from Ghana, who could not board her flight yesterday. She was still feeling sick. We tried to get her on board on Sunday. She couldn't, and then changed her ticket for Tuesday, but she still wasn't feeling good. So we sort of a little depleted up here, but hopefully we can make up for it with some interesting observations from both Judy and Chris. I wanted to take just a few minutes and summarize our previous two events, sort of to give an overview of what was discussed by the various panelists in October, November, and January, and to sort of set it up for Judy and Chris and Steve to take it up from there. In our first session in October, the theme was Right to City, and we heard some very interesting feedback from Bob Buckley, who started off with the history of the road to Rio. He focused on three time frames: 1976, 1996, and 2016. In 76, he talked about the convening of UN Habitat. He talked about how the GDP at that point, which was $3,500, the world per capita GDP, how it went from 3,500 to 10,000, which is today. And how in 1996, the GDP had grown by 35% from what it was in 1976, in the 20 years, and how it has grown multifolds between then and 2010. He talked about the fact that average African was poorer in 1996 than he or she was in 1976, which I thought was a critical message. He also talked about pessimism in 1996, and he talked about shake-ups happening in UN Habitat and so on and so forth, and the creation of Cities Alliance. These were some of the key things he mentioned about 1996. Then he jumped into 2010 and sort of talked about the optimism of probably more solutions, probably more players coming into the urban arena, and so on and so forth. We had other panelists that focused on urban labor, mapping, renewable energy. We talked about market-driven models to provide housing and services. Celine from SDI and Cities Alliance talked about challenges of formalizing pavement dwellers and slum dwellers, and also the importance of implanting the idea of savings among the poor. And one of the key messages which she mentioned was that the poor needs allies, and she shared with us several examples from Dharavi and from Mumbai. We had Anna Marie from HUD who talked very interestingly about some of the changes, some of the new thinking which HUD was thinking about. Two things that stands out in my mind. One was she mentioned that bringing urban development back into HUD. I remember her saying bringing UD back into HUD, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. And the second thing she mentioned was of collaborating more aggressively, more proactively with education, EPA, and transportation. And somebody from the audience in the question answer session also mentioned that perhaps a good idea to even include energy into the whole thinking. We had the second session in November, and the focus was equal access to shelter. And we had several interesting panelists there. Mohammed from UN Habitat talked about achieving inclusiveness and the importance of advocacy. He focused a lot on issues they are working with on land policies and linking policies to implementation. And at the global level, he mentioned things about how they do knowledge management or documenting best practices and dissemination, which I thought was interesting. We had Steve Akufo, who is a practitioner who's worked for the government of Ghana in the past and also is a practicing architect in Accra. I don't know if any of you were here during that session. He painted a very negative picture, I thought, on Ghana, and he quoted a whole host of examples of how things have not worked, which sort of piggybacks on what Bob Buckley talked about in the earlier session about Africa, which I thought was a good link. Here somebody was talking about real situations that's not happening or efforts being taken but no results. But look at the positive sides. I mean, I think we may hear from Judy on World Bank's New Urban Agenda, and they're picking Accra as one of the 4 pilot cities. So there are some positives for Ghana. So even though Steve sort of painted a negative picture, I think there's still a lot of hope. Milton talked a lot about transitional shelter, talked about packaging self-help driven programs and providing housing in a post-disaster situation, which sort of links back to what Celine mentioned in the first session about the work in Mumbai. Milton quoted a couple of things. He talked about the absence of strategic planning at city level in Honduras. He said while they were looking at implementing post-earthquake projects in 2002 and 3, they went back and saw master planning documents from the 80s and 90s, which since 1998 were never updated. So he was talking about the importance of having governance in a more proactive way. He highlighted the importance of microfinance and the importance of incremental growth, incremental housing, of both in the provision of water sanitation services and on home improvement lending. Janice Perlman was the last panelist there, and many of you know Janice. She talked a lot about favelas and experiences from Brazil, specifically the issues about crime and issues about security and how that sort of negates development. But one of the key things she mentioned, and she highlighted a couple of observations, was the importance of decoupling land ownership versus home ownership, and how you could come up with solutions which identify each of them independently. The last session, the third roundtable, was in January, and we had a good set of panelists there. Brian Wampler is a professor from Boise State. He talked about participatory budgeting. He's doing some research on it, written a couple of books, and he talked about 3 or 4 different things. He talked about how to promote deliberation, how to encourage social justice, how do you reward mobilization. I mean, I was part of a USAID program in India, and bulk of our activities was on mobilizing communities to do slum upgrading in partnership with the government. And at the end, it's that mobilization piece that doesn't get rewarded or even thanked. And I think he picked on that aspect very, very, very critically. He also talked about bringing institutional transparency, which I thought was universal. we had Mario Martin, who talked about several experiences from Central South America. And one of the things that sticks to my mind is how he compared smaller countries versus larger countries, and how urbanization and policies related to urbanization differs between the countries, and how from the governance standpoint. Brian English talked about several examples of the project CHF is doing in India with support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And he focused on two things. One, the importance of capacity building, and two, what is it that you can do to enable the voices of the poor be heard. And then we had Afifa Saeed from USAID, who provides several examples and observations on how cultural diversity and cultural issues needs to be brought in while packaging development and investment programs. That, in a nutshell, is the summary of the three panels we had. And today's topic, as Blair mentioned, is inclusive urbanization. And we have two panelists here for now. I'll first turn over to Judy, who said she'll talk about World Bank's thinking, experiences, and observations. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I especially appreciate the overview, since I haven't been to the sessions, so that was very interesting. It sounds like it's been very rich. Well, I was given a very open topic. I think it was called Sustainable Inclusive, or Inclusive Sustainable Urbanization, which, I think you can really cover just about everything in that. So I thought that it would be a good opportunity to present our new urban strategy. The bank has spent the last, say, year and a half or so working on the development of it. We've had a lot of lessons learned. We've taken stock of our own work. We've looked at others' works and tried to basically shape our thinking for the next decade. We only do this strategy once every 10 years, so it really does affect our program of activities and lending and the direction that we go in for the next decade. So I'm just going to take the opportunity to give you kind of an overview of that. I don't want to go on for too long, so it'll be fairly brief, but still give you a good flavor of it. And also, I'd just like to mention my colleague Barbara Lippman is here. She also works in the Urban Anchor with a specialization on housing, and was very much involved with the preparation of the strategy as well. So, I think it's just coming up. So here we go. Okay. So, just as some background that framed our thinking for the strategy, first we sort of looked at what are some major urban trends in the developing world. The first is the pace of urbanization. We know that about 90% of the urban growth that's going to happen in the next 2 decades is going to happen in developing countries, and that will add something like 2 billion new people to cities. We also, what's most noteworthy for this is really the pace of it. Historically, we've seen lots of urbanization, but not at this pace, and that is going to be a big challenge. Also, we know that poverty is urbanizing across the developing world, with the exception of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Urban poverty is growing relative to rural poverty, and a lot of that is due to urban migration. And now something like 70 to 75% of the urban residents in Africa and South Asia are poor. And a lot of them are people coming to the cities looking for work. Another big phenomenon is the growth of secondary cities. These have historically, at least with a lot of our work, been overlooked somewhat, but they're those cities that have less capacity than the megacities, but they're also growing the fastest. We also know that slums are growing. We've got now over 1 billion slums, but that's anticipated to continue to grow. And basically, it's a result of the inadequate supply of land and housing and the poor access of services. And then finally, there's the climate change agenda. It's really happening. A lot of it is happening right in cities. We know that 70% of the energy consumption and over 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities. So it's a major force. The key messages sort of for the overall framework of our strategy is first the new paradigm. And it's a shift in the bank's thinking about urbanization. Basically, we're moving from the paradigm that urbanization is just happening too fast and some of the primary cities are too large, to a paradigm where we look at the fact that urbanization, and a lot of this is coming from evidence from the World Development Report of 2009 on economic geography. Urbanization is, the new paradigm includes that urbanization is going to happen whether we like it or not. And it's essentially essential for economic growth and poverty reduction. And we have now a lot of evidence from cities on that. And as a result of it, we need to be much more proactive in planning for urbanization rather than only reacting to the negative consequences of it. And, just going back to Matthew's point about a certain sense of optimism, we're actually seeing a lot of changes both within the bank and outside towards a recognition of the benefits of urbanization and a growing awareness of the challenges and opportunities that it brings. For example, in the bank, we historically have been very focused on rural poverty, but we're starting to see an increase in our focus on urban poverty. And in our countries where we work, even in Africa, where, historically they've been very reluctant to think of urbanization as a positive process, we're starting to see some shifts in the dialogues in the countries that we're working in. Why do we care about urbanization? We know from the evidence that no country has actually been able to achieve successful economic development without urbanizing. Nearly all the countries that we looked at across the board have moved to middle income status have become at least 50% urbanized before reaching that. And of the high income countries, they're at least 70 to 80% urbanized. So there's a lot of evidence there. We know that cities, can become a locus for investments, job creation. Large cities can serve as a gateway for to the international economy, which is increasingly important with globalization. And we also know that the density of cities can achieve much greater efficiency in service delivery, which can ultimately benefit the poor. Here, we're just looking at the issue of density. We know that across the landscape in East Asia, the cities there have really provided a good model of economic density that attracts investments, it creates jobs, and really drives growth. And this picture is from East Asia, and it captures the spatial distribution of economic activity measured in GDP. And they've done this in East Asia by minimizing congestion costs through a lot of infrastructure investments in public and mass transit systems in particular. And we're seeing in places like China where 50% of the country's GDP is generated in only 20% of the land area. This urban density we see is really a model for developing regions when it comes to urban form and design. And it goes beyond issues of economic density, and there are some good examples of livable, really pleasantly livable cities such as Singapore. Here, again, going back to the overall framework of the strategy, we see it as not just cities in isolation, but within countries, systems of cities, where specific types of cities can specialize and actually work together to complement each other. And so, for example, the role of large cities, today, a lot of them have kind of moved away from manufacturing towards services, innovation, and higher end economic activity. But then this is where the secondary cities can now step in, provided they have investments in infrastructure. And provide a more competitive space for manufacturing. And then the smaller towns, still going back to, early economic geography thinking, have a very vital role to play in linking agricultural centers and serving as markets. A big challenge is, of course, land. I think whenever you talk about urban development, you can't avoid it. Here we have a program, it's called the Urban Growth Management Initiative, where we've been able to track the expansion of built-up areas across 120 cities over time. So here we have a image from Ghana, from Accra in 85, and then 15 years later in 2000, and you can see what's happening to the growth. Now, when we compile the information from this 120 cities, we see that actually the land mass has tripled, and it's creating a lot of urban sprawl and increasing the cost for infrastructure and, substantial cost to the environment coming out of transportation. And, this is going to have impacts on the kinds of urban planning that, gets captured in the future. Here was just really to highlight this and point out that there's an important role for both cities and national governments in enabling the shape of urban development. And Mumbai provides kind of a classic example where, there have been strong local interests which, contributed to the spatial distribution of the city. They had tried to keep density very low, and as a result, the prices in Mumbai are very, very expensive, comparable to New York or even higher, and that has huge implications for the way the city functions. And of course, everybody knows of Dharavi in Mumbai, one of the largest slums in the world. Just looking at the bank's trends in what we do in urban, we started almost 40 years ago in 1972. We've lent about almost $40 billion for urban projects during that period. You can see that, we were kind of, the end of the 80s was sort of our heyday in the early period, and then we declined dramatically. And that's been attributed to a shift away from financing for infrastructure generally in the development field, but then of course in the World Bank as well, and more of an emphasis on knowledge services. Well, back in around 2000, people started to pay attention to this trend, and we started to get a lot of demand from our client countries saying, we need basic infrastructure, we need to make these investments. So we had what we called our Infrastructure Action Plan, which began in 2004, and that's contributed. It was kind of a strategy for infrastructure and urban development, and that contributed to a substantial increase in lending. And now we've had, again, our more recently, a Sustainable Infrastructure Action Plan. And you can see that the lending is going way up. Between 2006 and 2008, the number of urban sector projects nearly doubled from 22 to 38. So it's going up dramatically, which means more work for us. So now just shifting briefly to sort of thinking forward about how to do business in this environment. How, what are we going to do that's different? How are we going to do it differently? One of the comments that we got many times over within the bank was that, nobody really knew what urban is. What does that mean? I mean, urban it's a space, and, what does the urban sector in the bank do? So we really spent a lot of time sharpening our business lines, looking at our portfolio. What are we doing? Where do we have comparative advantage? And, what is the demand like in our countries? So basically we have 5 key elements in the strategy that there are business lines. There, of course, at the middle, this middle circle there is focusing on the core function, which is, the role of local government. And then we have these other circles, which include urban poverty and slums, land and housing markets, urban environment, and city economies. And it's a fairly complex diagram, but I think one of the key messages here is that there are actual trade-offs in all of these. You can't really operate in a city without looking at all of them, but there are major trade-offs. For example, I work mostly on urban poverty. When you look at that and, you want to make investments in the urban poor, but there are also needs in the infrastructure, in city-level infrastructure, to promote growth and attract investment. But, there's simple trade-offs when it comes to where do you, when a city has limited resources, where do you invest? And there are similar kinds of trade-offs related to issues of sustainability, and equity and efficiency. So just to give you a flavor of what these 5 core areas look like, the first is, I mentioned sort of about local governments. Here it's kind of the bread and butter work that we do on city management, finance, and governance. Here, there's a big emphasis now trying to move away from specific projects that work in specific cities to more looking at, in a country, what can we do through wholesaling. And we have municipal development funds. We recently had a review of those, and they actually work pretty well. So I think we're going to try to strengthen some of the work that we do there, providing, basic funds for infrastructure and working through financial intermediaries. We have looking at the, legal and regulatory frameworks that can help cities access market financing and other things. We're looking at participatory budgeting as a way to improve governance and transparency. And then also we have something called, or have been associated with, the Global City Indicators Program, which is an attempt to try to benchmark key indicators for cities so that they can know how they look over time and how they look in comparison to other cities. The second area, again, this is the area I work most on, urban, so I put 2 slides in. So it's on urban poverty and slum upgrading. Here, the first thing, is really important to emphasize. The bank has done, a huge amount of work on urban poverty, and we know that economic growth is critical to poverty reduction. So whatever we do, that has to be one of the key pillars. And that comes through a lot of ways, and part of it is urbanization. We are looking at, so we've been doing a lot of urban upgrading, but again, we don't really reach the mass. Oftentimes, by the time we've finished an upgrading program, there's so many new slums around it that it feels like a drop in the bucket. So we're trying to look at national level scaling up through some policy changes. A lot of it is related to land, to be able to go to scale. And we're working in a few countries on such approaches. And Vietnam is a good example of a country that's really moving pretty fast on providing basic services for the urban poor. We've also learned a lot over the last decade or more on engaging with community-based organizations, finding ways to work with them in scaling up. There's a lot of evidence about, Marcia would know because we had a big discussion about slum mapping yesterday, but just putting the poor on the map and finding new ways to do that, such as GIS technologies. And then even though the urban sector doesn't particularly work on income and employment programs, there's a lot of evidence about the importance of those, as well as safety net programs. And other parts of the bank, we increasingly working with them. A lot of the traditional safety net programs have been particularly run out of rural areas and focusing on the rural poor. But increasingly, especially with the financial crisis last year and the food crisis, we started to see it was the urban poor that were hit the hardest, and we needed to find ways to reach them. And so I think there's a lot of new work there. I'm going to just emphasize this right now because it's happening very fast, and I'm in the midst of it. Coming out of Copenhagen, there was a mayor's summit, and the president of the bank actually addressed the summit, and there was a task force that was formed coming out of this to look at issues of climate change in the urban poor. And the task force is going to take a three-prong approach. They're going to study the linkages better. The bank is leading a big study now on that. Identify where there are some good practice of cities that have been able to try to look at climate change in the urban poor, and then identify some investment opportunities. So there's a lot of money that's being talked about for adaptation to climate change, and I think from an urban perspective, we are trying to position ourselves to have the right information to be able to channel those funds into basic upgrading, which is, an adaptation to climate change. So we can give it a fancy name, climate smart services and shelter for the urban poor, but essentially it's urban upgrading. So this is, I think, maybe a new name for an old product, but it's something I think we're going to see a lot more of. So the next area is urban land and housing, and here we'll continue the work that we do on supporting mortgage finance, but increasingly I think we'll look at issues of rental housing, which the bank has not been particularly engaged in. And again, Barbara would know more about this. And then, looking at more housing approaches for the poor, also including incremental housing improvement. It's not kind of an all or nothing thing. And I think we have a lot of evidence from the field that is how the poor invest in their housing. Cities and economic growth. Here, again, we have several pillars. First is just a basic infrastructure for cities. And it will, again, be doing a lot of that through municipal development funds. But we have a growing business on cultural heritage and sustainable tourism. And we have a trust fund which helps us identify some opportunities. And really, it is a growing field. We're seeing a lot of increase in lending. And there's a lot of job creation that's coming out of it. So it's got a kind of a win-win for economic development and addressing issues of poverty and unemployment. And then finally, we're starting to see a lot of demand, especially in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but other regions as well, for brownfield redevelopment. And this is a new area for the bank, but again, I think the business there is increasing. Finally, urban environment, climate change, and natural disaster, and undoubtedly that is where the work is growing the fastest. We are doing a lot of work both on the mitigation and adaptation side, looking at attracting carbon financing, doing some analytical work and helping cities prepare for reducing their emissions. We have some products such as the Eco2 Cities, which looks at both environment and economic development, which is essentially sustainable urbanization. And then, increasing some of our lending. We're doing some lending on green cities. I believe in Mexico we've done a major loan to help the city address some of their energy issues in a sustainable way. Finally, here again we're looking at some new partnerships and putting a real focus on knowledge management and knowledge brokerage. So the bank, we've always produced some amount of information on urban issues, but I think we're trying to leverage our role as having partners all around the world to be able to pull that information together and do some dissemination, working with other partners outside, forging new partnerships. And then one thing that we're not very good at, which I think we always probably say this in every strategy, is to do a better job at documenting good practice. There's so much out there that really people don't know about because nobody, takes the time to sit down and write it up. So I think we're looking at new ways of doing that too. You may even start to see more video clips and other technologies where you can get that information out. Just two quick tools that are new. Matthew mentioned one is the Urbanization Review, and this is a new diagnostic tool that goes back to some of the earlier slides on the systems of cities, where we basically take a holistic look within a country at how they're urbanizing. We provide them with some of the basic diagnostic information, then helps them to, identify some of the priorities in their strategies. And we've got pilots in 4 countries. This is a new instrument for the bank, and I think it will feed very much into our country dialogues. Again, so it'll help, externally, but also within the bank. We have our own challenges of getting urbanization issues on the table. And then finally, urban vulnerability assessment. We had a meeting over the last 2 days on that. Our feeling is, again, with all these adaptation funds that are potentially available, we need to have good diagnostic information on how cities are vulnerable to climate change, to disasters, and within cities, we're the most vulnerable areas, and we know from other work that it's typically the urban poor. So we're trying to come up with a standardized tool. We had a partners meeting over the last 2 days where we invited a bunch of experts from outside, and we're trying to come up with something that would be somewhat unified. We're going to pilot it this year, and then ideally we could do this with partners in a large number of cities and actually create a strong database of information about cities and their vulnerabilities and risks associated with climate change and disasters. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And this is the second time I'm hearing the presentation on your new urban strategy. And I think every time I hear, I pick new pieces, which I think also resonates with some of our panelists in the past. Thank you very much. Chris, let me turn over to you. I know we heard Mohammed talk about some of the UN Habitat experiences in the shelter standpoint, and he talked a lot of your thinking in terms of what's going on now and in future, and with things that's happening now vis-a-vis urbanization, things that we see in Haiti, and with the upcoming WOF. I think we can look at inclusive, sustainable urbanization in a different light, and would love to hear your thoughts and views on some of those areas.
Thanks. I'm a little torn as to what to emphasize in this brief overview, but I think what might be helpful on the heels of the World Bank's presentation of their urban strategy is to touch a little bit on how UN Habitat has taken on increased urbanization, climate change issues broadly, and then sort of move a little bit more towards the World Urban Forum. And since this is the last session in your sequence, to talk really about how to use World Urban Forum. And I think I'll speak largely from a U.S. perspective, given that the majority of folks here are from various U.S. institutions, because I see it as an extraordinary opportunity for U.S. both domestic and international folks that are working in U.S. So that's my flow. I hope that's all right with you, and Blair and Judy. In terms of a multilateral agency, I think it's important to make a slight distinction between the bank and Habitat, in the sense that Habitat is one of many specialized agencies within the UN system, like the bank is the largest of the Bretton Woods institutions. Our board structure is not ministers of finance, it's more ministers of housing, local government, ministers of cities. Governments from around the world sit on our board and give us advice on how we should move forward, much as ministers of finance sit on the board of the World Bank to give advice on how they should be progressing for the coming year. The UN Habitats, like the bank, has undergone a lot of changes in terms of how it's wrestling with older issues in old wine and new bottles, as you were suggesting, and newer issues. I'd just like to pinpoint two. One is large multilateral agencies are very hard to manage, let alone govern. They're complicated because we have a board of 57 governments that are telling us what to do. So to reach consensus among them is not an easy exercise. So one exercise that we went through in the last 4 years was to move from a situation where we were doing everything, because urbanization is such a broad issue and it deals with so many different aspects to it, to trying to concretize our work around what we call 5 focus areas. And this is partly a as the academics would say, a heuristic device. It's an arbitrary breaking down a very complicated issue in order to make sense of it. But from a bureaucratic standpoint, it has really helped to streamline a lot of different activities. So we have moved from sort of covering urbanization, housing and urban development, everything under the sun, into 5 areas. And these are very broadly the work of advocacy, monitoring, and research. I guess that would be the equivalent of the bank's knowledge management activities. The second is to really nail down the question of shelter and land. The third is to grapple with infrastructure needs from an environmentally sound perspective. The fourth is to look at areas of innovation, community savings, private domestic capital, and public investment, a mixture of those 3. And lastly, to look at the issue of urban governance, management, and planning. We have an overarching one, which is our more internal, which is excellence in management. We're trying to move from a small ma and pa shop of the UN family to a full-fledged program, which we were made by the General Assembly about 7 years ago. And it takes a bit of time to become a full-fledged program within the UN system. You really have to turn around your operations and systematize them, and have the kind of not only focus areas but management systems in place to achieve much more efficient organization, and that a number of things. I could talk for hours about results-based management and our accounting mechanisms and just how we work, but I'll spare you that lecture. These focus areas are not be-all and end-all. Of course, we continue to have different things, and we try to fit them in these different boxes, and we're a good bureaucracy. But what it has done, I think, is done 2 things. One, it's made us a lot more focused in terms of internal work, and also our relationships with partners has been a lot more effective, because when you're more organized internally, the way you interface with the myriad of organizations at country level and internationally is a lot better. People kind of know how to navigate your institution, and if they're interested in land issues, then they sort of know where to go. It's not 6 different places, it's one area, and there's a good focal point who's recognized within the institution. So I just want to say that we've kind of internally gone through an exercise of really trying to focus our work, and for those that had attended the previous presentation by my colleague Mohammed El-Sufi, he gave much more depth to that. So I just wanted to touch on that one aspect. In terms of climate change, I was just joking with Judy in the way in this morning, just before we came in to this session, that I think for those that are interested in urban poverty issues, climate change has actually become an extremely important development. As Judy was joking, that adaptation is now, or I should say, upgrading is now masquerading as adaptation. I'm being a bit provocative here, but essentially what's happening is that all the things that you'd need to do to help a city adapt to climate changes are virtually the same that you would want to include the urban poor in decision making, try to wrestle with heavy land issues, try to deploy resources more equitably throughout that city, etc. In other words, the discussion of how to adapt to climate change mirrors so closely the challenge of upgrading slums, or making informal settlements and unplanned settlements more part of the city and integrated, including the people that are in them and not just the physical space. This alignment is, I think, a very powerful development that we will see evolve over the next 5 to 10 years in I think, very meaningful ways. One of the reasons for that is that climate change is very politically neutral, relatively speaking. I know it's got a long history in this country, but globally, climate change is sort of a no-brainer. There isn't a city manager in the world that isn't thinking about, how do I begin to introduce energy efficiency? How do I try to mitigate carbon emissions? How do I try to anticipate for as my daughter likes to say, global warming. She doesn't call it global warming. She goes, global warning. It can take all different forms. And I think that is a very different ideology than a mayor that gets up and says, I'm going to solve the problem of the urban poor. Immediately, interests are affected, and there are a lot of vested interests in the status quo in many of the cities that we're working. And I think by dealing with this through the masquerading, as it were, of adaptation, in a way, the politics is easier for that city official, for that mayor, for that government, for the international community, for a number of players, that allows cities to grapple with very difficult issues of inequality. So I think I'm perhaps I'm in an optimistic mood at the moment, but I think there are some spaces for things to happen on the front of inclusion and overcoming historical inequalities in cities that didn't exist before the climate change debate. So I'd just like to signal that. I think another important development is just the recognition of urbanization by, I should call them the unconverted. Organizations and institutions that really, this wasn't on their map at all 3 or 4 years ago, and now it's very much there. Let me give a couple of examples. We do a lot of work in humanitarian assistance and post-conflict situations, post-disaster situations. And recently, Habitat has been elevated to be a member of a principal organizing body known as the Interagency Standing Committee for Humanitarian Affairs, the IASC. It's chaired by John Holmes, who's the Undersecretary General for OCHA, and includes a number of UN agencies, the major international NGOs, the Federation of Red Cross, etc. And they have brought us in because they realize that there's an urban dimension to humanitarian assistance that they really don't have a handle on. And whether it's food delivery systems, as we're seeing in Haiti, it's largely an urban crisis situation, and how to deal with it, to IDPs, which are often internally displaced persons that are moving from one urban center to another and very hard to get hold of and to measure and to assist, et cetera. So in the whole humanitarian assistance, there's a discussion on urbanization that didn't exist 4 or 5 years ago, and I think that's encouraging. Another discussion is on urbanization that is perhaps not common is the whole debate on agriculture. And this is, I was invited to speak at the U.S. Department of Agriculture on urban-rural linkages, but more broadly, the long-run implications in rural areas for agricultural development and food security of urbanization. In other words, what's happening as people are moving from rural to urban areas? How is that changing the national economy? And what is the implications for those that grow food, those that process food, those that consume food? And through that chain of use and production and consumption. And what is that like in terms of the bank study on economic geography, and more generally on this trend of shift from urbanization? So that I think historically we've often seen somewhat of an artificial divide between agricultural development and urban development. And I think by virtue of the fact that urbanization demographically and as an issue of concern to many institutions is gaining momentum, the agricultural community is saying, how can we take advantage of this concentration of population in urban areas to reorient agricultural production and food processing in a way that improves rural livelihoods? So this is, I think, a discussion that's extremely important, because if it succeeds and progresses well, we will overcome, especially in this country, but in most development agencies, a somewhat artificial divide between rural and urban development, where a disproportionate amount of resources are going to agricultural development to the exclusion of urban, which is actually hurting rural development. So this kind of discussion, I think, is another development. So I just want to say that urbanization hasn't quite come of age. I think there's still some more time, but there are new institutions and new actors that are responding to the demographic changes and the political, social, and cultural and economic implications of rapid urbanization, which are affecting people who are not working for the urban anchor within the World Bank or UN Habitat as an agency specializing in urbanization within the UN, that there are other people that are starting to come to terms with this. And I think it's within that context that Blair, myself, Michael, others, we have, I think, been very strategic in making sure that the U.S. government has gotten its hooks into this issue through World Habitat Day that took place in October 2009, where HUD especially, the State Department and the White House and the Department of Agriculture took an active role in supporting the World Habitat Day celebrations and beginning to grapple with urbanization, both from an international perspective in terms of U.S. foreign assistance and from a domestic perspective in terms of sustainable metropolitan development and what that means, and where U.S. Cities are fitting within a global discussion on how to manage urban development at the metropolitan level. So I think both on the international front and the domestic front, we in a sense have captured this opening that's occurring in new quarters of an understanding of urban issues and begun to create spaces for that. And this leads me into the last part of my presentation, which is another opening, which is the World Urban Forum. And I think I think it was partly because we were able to get the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to sign on to World Habitat Day, that we have really quite an extraordinary U.S. presence coming to the World Urban Forum. And I think that not only World Habitat Day, but the fact that the Secretary mentioned at World Habitat Day that he would lead a delegation to World Urban Forum, that I think sent the right signal to the State Department, the White House, private sector groups, various associations, municipal authorities, and non-governmental organizations, that this was something that they should take seriously. So last I've heard, and Alvin can correct me, but I think there are over 40 members of the U.S. delegation that are quite senior in government positions and across the board in various non-governmental institutions. And I would say that list will probably expand, and I can envision anywhere between 300 and 400 U.S. citizens from U.S.-based institutions attending in Rio, which is a drop in the bucket of the most recent tally I got this morning when I called Nairobi. 12,300 people are registered for World Urban Forum, and from 120 countries. So and that's a month out. So we're expecting a registration between 18 and 19,000, and we usually find that there's a 50% attrition rate. So of those, the figure that you get, the number of people that are registered and the number of people actually come, it's often a 2-to-1 ratio. So roughly 10,000 people are likely to come to this event, which I think is exciting. In terms of the World Urban Forum, I'd like to just touch on a couple of things about how we might want to utilize World Urban Forum as institutions that are based in the greater U.S. area, greater Washington area, and in the United States, so as to, in a sense, leverage this opportunity for the purposes of future work in this area. So let me just touch on a few thoughts, and I think we have some time, since I guess Steve is detained and unfortunately our Ghanaian colleague couldn't make it, to open it up for discussion. And I also would hope that we'd have much more give and take on the World Bank urban strategy, because I think Judy's barely scratched the surface of what's a very interesting strategy. But the themes of the World Urban Forum, I mean, I could be exhaustive, but let me be selective instead. The rights issue is a very big one, and I just want to underscore that, especially for the Brazilians. For the Brazilians, the right to the city, as we heard from Janice Perlman in her presentation in the previous session, it's a big deal. It's built into their constitution. They were urbanizing precisely at the time. They were going through massive urbanization at the beginning of that transition, precisely at the time that they were coming out of a fairly authoritarian set of governance structures to one that was more open and democratic. So that the issue of access to the city in economic, social, cultural, political decision making is not detached from a more open and democratic society as a whole. So in other words, that urban, in a sense, the urban is a concentration is an expression and concentration of a national trend that the country went through. And what does that mean? Why am I getting into some of this history? I think when they see the right to the city, it's a big deal. It's not just something that has to be signed as a document. It's something that's kind of guttural. It really hits a nerve when you talk to Brazilians. And they're very proud that they're hosting not only World Urban Forum, but that the theme of World Urban Forum is the right to the city. And I think we should take note of that and try to, in the time between now and Brazil, in Rio, to try to get a better understanding to that history, to read Janice's book and others that are written on urban issues in Brazil, and get a better handle on what the Brazilians have gone through, because they're going to be very active, and they're going to be very, very strong on this issue. And I'm impressing upon U.S. government officials as much as I am people here, because they will, I think, be pressed to sort of state what is the U.S. position on rights. And I know that under Secretary Clinton, there's been a lot of discussion about revisiting rights-based issues and rights-based approaches. There's been a strong gender and youth focus to that, which is very big on Secretary Clinton's agenda. But it's more broad, and I think that the people who are interested in looking at rights are going through an internal process within the State Department to think through how best to recalibrate the U.S. position over time, given the changes that have happened in the world since that review has taken place recently. So I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic between the U.S. government's evolving position on rights, and the issue of the Brazilians to focus on the right to the city. I just want to emphasize one point on that issue that often, as my Brazilian colleagues have told me, the Brazilians are quick to sign a document because it might not be implemented. They're a little nervous about, they're not as nervous as an American would be in terms of putting their name to something that is aspirational. Whereas in the United States, writing something that's aspirational has legal implications. And from a U.S. context, particularly from an international context, there is always a serious discussion internally about what are the implications of signing on to something. Rio is not going to provide a declaration, but there will be pressure to work towards, there are a lot of people in the human rights community who will look at the Rio conference as an indicator of what could happen in the next Human Rights Conference, Human Rights Council meeting in terms of the U.S. positions on housing. And not just housing, but more broadly a set of rights that are within the panoply of rights to the right to the city. So I think I just want to tap on the rights perspective, and I'm not talking about this in global context. I'm trying to focus on Brazil and sort of U.S. implication. A second issue, which is one I've touched on already, is the whole issue of sustainability and climate change. And I think this is going to be riding right through the conference among all member states and participants from all walks of life that are coming from these 120 countries. And this, in addition to my discussion about adaptation masquerading as upgrading and vice versa, I think there's something interesting about the shared experience of climate change that is bringing people together, bringing people closer together. So it's not just an relatively ideologically neutral issue, but it's also something that's abundantly transcending industrialized and agrarian countries. It's something that is affected just about everybody. And that common denominator, I think, is going to offer space for dialogue that transcends cultural boundaries and industrial agrarian boundaries that might not be the case before. And I think that presents a huge opportunity at this World Urban Forum to, in a sense, extend the conversation in ways that have not happened before. The last, there are 6 focus areas, and I'm not going to, 6 dialogues, and I'm not going to mention all of them, but let me just add one more, and that is the question of inequalities. And this is something that actually the bank and Habitat are working on very closely for what is called Dialogue 2, which is overcoming the urban divide and zeroing in on the question of how do you deal with urban inequalities. What is the larger strategy to overcome historical inequalities? How do you package together an economic strategy with training and education that can lead in a multi-generational way. And I think this is an issue that is extremely relevant to the Haiti recovery and reconstruction issue. I think it's got to be front and center for those that are dealing with a longer term for reconstruction. But it's not limited to Haiti. There are unfortunately many Haitis, and I think that the ability to kind of capture that issue is made more abundant in this particular dialogue on overcoming the urban divide. Let me stop there on the themes and ideas, but I'm just trying to cue you in on some things that are emerging and some potential opportunities. On a more mechanical level, in addition to the dialogues and what we call thematic open debates, which are coupled with the dialogues, is the roundtables. And roundtables are, I think, very powerful tools for different interest groups to come together. Right now there's a ministerial roundtable that is set up on the first day, and a mayor's roundtable, a researcher's roundtable, a business roundtable, a youth roundtable, a parliamentarians roundtable. In other words, in addition to having thematic discussions, there's what we've learned over the years is we need to set up a mechanism in the World Urban Forum that allows peer review, that allows peer-to-peer discussion, whether it's mayors, ministers, academics, business people, youth, etc., to advance their issues as they're approaching urbanization. And the participation, just to give the ministerial roundtable as one example, are quite significant. I mean, we are anticipating over 40 ministers that will be from different departments of housing and urban development around the world, and they are organized by region. And what UN Habitat has worked with other member states over the last 10 years is to build up what we call ministerial conferences on housing and urban development. So there's an African ministerial conference, there's a Latin American, an Asian. Recently we're trying to create a Middle Eastern conference on housing and urban development. And the persons that chair each of these ministerial conferences will be principal speakers at the ministerial roundtable. So each of these is organized in such a way that they're, in a sense, building on existing forums in a global forum to begin to engage in a discussion that transcends different regions. And I know that sounds like a geographical overload, but essentially what it's doing is the World Urban Forum is not the end of the story. Each of these regional forums, ministerial forums, can take from the World Urban Forum and begin to accelerate their work at regional level. So, for example, the next African Ministerial Conference on Housing and Urban Development, which takes place March in 2011, very much will be catalyzed by the World Urban Forum because they're interacting with other regions. Why is this important? Why do we have to have this kind of global discussion? Well, what's fascinating about this World Urban Forum is that it's hosted not just by Brazil, but in Latin America, which has been the fastest urbanizing part of the developing world. And they have a lot to say to the Africans and the Asians and experiences to share, and they're very concerned that the kind of problems that they went through are not reproduced in other regions of the world. So there's a kind of interesting discussion that's going to emerge that is very much a South-South discussion. And then, of course, because of climate change, very much a North-South discussion, which is almost obliterating the distinction between North-South. So the Ministerial Roundtable, just to give one example, I think is an exciting space. And the same is the case for the other groups that I had mentioned. The exhibition space in World Urban Forum is like another conference. And for those of you that will be going, I think you should you should anticipate planning on spending a lot of time in the exhibition, because often it's the informal discussions, spontaneous meetings, people that you meet and groupings that suddenly happen where you can actually get a lot of work done in terms of advancing a particular set of partnerships that you're working on. This may not be pre-planned. It could be something that just comes out of the fact that you attended a networking event together or a dialogue and you realize, wait a minute, we're all here. We can respond to this particular issue. And the exhibition space is much more informal. It's not scheduled. Everything is fairly open and flexible. And there are an enormous set of exhibitions from around the world, 120 countries, of people and their not only best practices, but essentially what they're doing. And just traveling around the exhibition is in itself a taste of what's happening. You don't have to just attend the conferences and workshops. You can really get a feel of what's going on just by checking out the exhibition. Let me end by just saying that I think where do we take this from here in terms of World Urban Forum? I'm hoping that there is a much deeper discussion between the private sector and the NGO and non-governmental organization groupings. I think that not only in post-conflict situations but in development generally, you will see an extraordinary showing of private sector representation. This will probably be the largest private sector representation, and thanks to Blair, I've hoodwinked Steve Jordan and company with the Business Civic Leadership Center, who served on the honorary committee for preparing for World Habitat Day. I just had a breakfast meeting with him this morning. There is an enormous scope for collaboration among about 25 different multinational corporations or associations of businesses. The U.S. Green Building Council, private sector groups that are in the green business area, together with the Business Civic Leadership Center, Coca-Cola, National Association of Realtors, large presence of Google, large presence of Gallup, Siemens. In other words, a lot of private companies that are realizing that they need to be part of this discussion. That this is not just about where they can sell products, it's about the footprint that these companies leave on urban areas, which in the case of multinationals is quite large. And I think, again, there is an enormous opening in terms of discussion between these private sector entities, local authorities, particularly municipal authorities, and lastly, non-governmental organizations. So I think, while it may seem odd bedfellows, I think that I would encourage those in this room that are coming from government and non-governmental organizations to reach out to private sector entities and vice versa, to engage in a discussion about what you're doing in cities. And if there are opportunities for various forms of collaboration. And I think what's happening broadly within the private sector debate, and urbanization is accelerating that, and private companies working in urban areas is accelerating that, is a move beyond corporate social responsibility. I think essentially what's emerging is that a lot of private sector entities are realizing that they're only reaching a small fraction of these cities in emerging markets, a small subset of those that can afford their services. And what they're doing increasingly is beginning to develop products and services that are much more in line with the ways and means of people in informal settlements and slums. Developing partnerships with local authorities, working with creative NGOs. There's an enormous acceleration in innovation and experimentation in that area, and I would encourage you to take advantage of World Urban Forum for that purpose. I think, just to end on the last note, I'd really like to thank the Rockefeller Foundation, Woodrow Wilson, and CHF, because this was kind of just an idea 6 months ago, and the fact that you were able to pull it off and there was some support for this, and you were able to provide continuity between World Habitat Day and World Urban Forum is very encouraging to me. And I think what I'd like to discuss with you and others is what we do after World Urban Forum, and how we can potentially take advantage of that momentum and look at a new instrument, which I'm not going to get into, the World Urban Campaign that UN Habitat is experimenting with. It will be launched at the World Urban Forum as a way to sustain these kinds of conversations and direct them to new initiatives. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Good overview. I think we heard two very interesting experiences and strategies and thinking, and I think all of us are thinking around the same lines, especially with WOOF coming up and also as part of our work. It's obvious that Steve is not coming today, so we'll end here in terms of presentations, but we have about 20 minutes to take about 5 or 6 questions, and we can close from after that. But I have to say that we are coming up with a summary document of all these 4 sessions, and if there are any questions you wanted to ask from the previous sessions, if you want to put it up here, I'll be happy to take those questions and see if I can get back to you on. Thank you. Gretchen.
Since climate change seems like it's going to be a major focus in the World Urban Forum, I'm just wondering, since here in the U.S. maybe we're the only ones that are unenlightened, but as you know, not everybody here in the U.S. is on board with climate change. A lot of this decision makers are not on board with climate change, and that makes it difficult to really get it into the serious agenda of the U.S. when you have a lot of people in power that really aren't on board yet. So I'm wondering at the World Urban Forum how that's being dealt with, since is it assuming that everybody there, all the people from private industry and the ministries worldwide are all agreeing that climate change is an issue and is science-based and et cetera, or maybe there could be some tools to give some of the decision makers how to convince other decision makers and constituents that it really is a problem. So I was just wondering if you have any sense on how that, I guess, a non-believer issue is being addressed at the forum.
Anybody else on the same theme? Climate change, willingness?
Can you start, Judy?
Sure.
Sure.
I think it's probably a self-selection. The people that are coming to the World Urban Forum are probably a subset of the wider community that is, for them, it's not an issue. We need to deal with it. So I think that would probably be a subset of the private sector entity, a subset of the government entities, a subset of the international non-governmental organizations, and various associations, of which the U.S. Conference of Mayors, just to focus on the municipal side, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the League of Cities, the International City Managers Association, and the National Association of Counties are all very involved in the preparations for World Urban Forum, but they've also been involved with Copenhagen. And so for them, this is another application, but it's actually kind of much more concentrated, because it's how do we deal with cities where the rubber meets the road, where we really have to kind of operationalize this discussion. It's not an abstraction. It's not a global debate. It's more, how do you create jobs at the same time that you lower carbon emissions? How do you help cities prepare for higher sea levels, greater disasters, heating, etc. There are very focused training sessions on this, where city managers will be undertaking 3-hour workshops that are focused on looking at best practice and innovation. What has former chairman of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Greg Nichols from Seattle, who mobilized roughly 1,000 cities to meet the Kyoto protocols without national government clearance on that. Again, it's a subset of the larger mayors, but it's 1,000 cities that have sort of gone through this process. The Chicago climate plan. We just heard today that the activities of the New York City Director of Planning, Economic Planning at the bank, there was a discussion at lunchtime. I think it's a subset, but there is a focus on how to do it. It's not so much a debate about what is the carbon emission standard that we should meet. It's more how do we do this in a way that actually works. It's practical, where it's not an either or between energy efficiency and jobs, for example.
Judy?
I mean, for the bank right now, climate change really is at the core of our agenda. We just completed the World Development Report, just was released in Copenhagen, which provides, a strong bank position on addressing this as a priority for our work. And in fact, quite honestly, much of our work is being reoriented to consider climate change issues and looking at both adaptation and mitigation. So I would say, for us, this is the way we're doing our business now. And, it's been endorsed by our board of directors, and it's the approach that we've taken. So, going to a meeting such as the World Urban Forum, it's very much at the core of what we're doing.
Anybody in the audience want to respond to that question? Okay, next question. Please. Gentleman behind Barbara, please.
Thank you. My name's Dave Leipson with the International Housing Coalition. This is also sort of a believer-non-believer question, but relative to the bank strategy, or on urban itself, you noted the shift in thinking to see urban as at least not as negative as it used to be, and maybe positive. I guess the question is, has there been thinking about sort of the causal side as it relates to economic development and poverty? In other words, there's the fact that everybody that's developed is urban, and that there's the fact that so much of GDP is produced in urban areas. But any thinking in the linkage of how that happens and what brings it about? And I'm asking the question as an advocate, because I think there is still a lot of the world that doesn't believe in urban as a positive, and so we need better arguments and illustrations for. And so I guess I'm asking, in your development of the strategy, was there any discussions of the causal linkages as opposed to the evidence that it's there, and how we can use those in advocacy?
I think if you look at the World Development Report of 2009 on economic geography, there is in that document a lot of evidence about, I don't know if it's causal per se, but about the benefits of urbanization and how that contributes to growth, and draws on a lot of the literature on what we know about poverty reduction, which a key element of that is economic growth. So I'm not sure if it's exactly linking causes, one point to another, but again, a lot of the evidence is there. They took a broad view at developed countries, cities like London. What did they look like 100 years ago? What kind of slums did they have? And there's a lot of evidence about that with urbanization and with over time with economic development, they all started out with slums as well, but they've addressed it over time and become world-class cities. So,
Barbara, I'll come back to you.
But I'll take it after the next question.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you, Matthew. You mentioned the gentleman from Ghana who was here, I think, a couple of sessions ago. And what I remember about him was his skepticism about conferences and about forums. And so hearing Chris describe what's in store at the World Urban Forum sounds very exciting to me. And you mentioned a couple of new elements like the South-South cooperation and the involvement of the private sector. But Chris, have you encountered this kind of skepticism? And what would your answer be to someone, was his name Steve?
Steve Okafor,
yeah. To Steve about why he should feel more optimistic about the outcome of the World Urban Forum?
I think Steve's critique was multi-layered. I mean, it was a great presentation. I liked it a lot, actually. So I think the aspect of international forums was, he presented that in the context of sort of meetings and workshops and conference, in a broad sense, the sort of development rituals of gathering that tend to dominate. And if you're on the receiving end of that, and you're at his age where you've seen these projects for 30 years, you become a little skeptical about the development process as a whole, of which conferences and workshops and expert group meetings and all those sets of rituals become quite cynical. So I think his comments need to be seen in that context. It wasn't necessarily the World Urban Forum per se. But to take the point straight up, my thinking is twofold. One is that I think what's unique about this meeting is that it's not a government meeting. It's a meeting with governments, but there's a lot of people in there that are not governments who probably wouldn't have gone to the meeting otherwise. There's something about the space, it's flexible enough, the nature of this gathering is such that it provides for a discussion that is not, in a sense, overwhelmed by a huge declaration, a resolution, or something that's going to come out of it as a binding agreement. So I think it's more fluid, both to government participation and includes non-government groups, and therefore provides a state non-state discussion that I think is probably healthy and needed, not just in urban issues but in general. The second thing is that I think for the development professional set and for a lot of associations, not development associations but various trade associations and organizations, they have decided to align their annual meetings or regional meetings around World Urban Forum. So you could probably count 150 side meetings that are occurring on the occasion of World Urban Forum because people want to utilize resources more effectively. So instead of having an organization A having its annual meeting in Paris or Tokyo or Washington, they've said, well, why don't we align that with the World Urban Forum, and then we can save costs. We don't have to get everybody to come to the World Urban Forum. We're going to have that annual meeting anyway. And that's particularly the case for associations, membership organizations. But it's also true for various regional and international organizations. So I think the second answer would be people are being quite economical in their use of this meeting. They're kind of hitting a number of birds with one stone. And then the last thing, I think, is not only for climate change advocacy, but also for advocacy about urban issues. There are not many forums like this. I don't think there really is another global space that allows for this discussion. And I think what you're getting at the World Urban Forum are 10 to 15,000 people who are a subset, in a sense, they're fringe elements within their respective institutions, who by virtue of going to the World Urban Forum can say to their respective institutions, there's a conversation happening that we need to be aware of. We need to think about how to integrate that aspect of urbanization into our core activities. So I think that's one of the subtle byproducts of this meeting. It's not so much what happens at the meeting, it's more the fact that it exists allows individuals to come back after World Urban Forum and begin to develop a portfolio of activities within their respective institutions or associations that includes some of the momentum that came out of World Urban Forum. So I respect the cynicism of our Ghanaian colleague. I think it's healthy and it's good to get called on it. I would say, though, that in the case of the World Urban Forum, this is how I would respond. I just want to touch on the other point raised about skepticism on urbanization, if I didn't get a chance to respond to that just quickly. I think part of the answer is the arguments that I made in my presentation, which is that for those interested in poverty reduction generally, the fact that so much of it is becoming urban it's almost unavoidable. That climate change debate kind of comes together in urban areas, that agricultural development, there's a new discussion among agriculturalists that we need to be thinking about the urbanization, and then in the post-conflict, post-disaster thing. I think these new conversations that are happening in other areas means that the sort of older debates about urban versus rural or rather urban is bad, I think is not gone, but there are grounds for it being addressed. And I think the last thing is to, when you look at slum formation historically, in particular cities, you begin to see that it's not an accident that it's happened, that the political economy of that country and the governance structures in previous colonial and post-colonial situations did a lot to inform not only the construction of cities, but the shape that those cities took and the inequalities that existed in those cities. And when governments came to power, independent governments came to power, they often had to overcompensate for that colonial period, and in so doing, they put in place a set of policies that almost reproduced the problem in reverse form. So when you get into the history of this stuff, you see that the historical determinants of slum formation are so deep that it behooves anyone to wrestle with the urban slum question in order to sort out a lot of things that go beyond slums.
Judy, you have a response to Barbara's question?
No.
Next question, you have here.
This may sound cynical too, but not totally meant that way. How deep do you think the interest in urban goes, both in your institution and more broadly, I guess, in Chris's sort of network of networks kind of thing? Urban has been the flavor of the month, every decade or every 20 years. And I'm wondering how much the interest in urban exists deeply on its own, or it's really being dragged by, the flavor of the month of climate change, which would be too bad because it has a life of its own and it really does inform a lot of other stuff. So I know the bank did urban, then it didn't do urban, and now it's doing urban again. And you can't keep doing that. You need a continuous sort of presence if you're going to have any change. So I'm wondering how if you feel that the feeling about urban is now deep enough that it can stand on its own.
It's a very interesting question. I think we're still in the early stages. We're starting to see an upsurge. So I'll be perfectly honest. I work on urban, so I'm clued into it. I believe in it. But I have a lot of colleagues, especially with our in our regions, at the level of our country directors who make decisions about, managing their country programs, that it still hasn't sunk in. So, we just launched our strategy in November, and we're still doing dissemination. So, I think it's yet to be seen. But I think what's driving a lot of this, globally outside the bank and increasingly within the bank are the facts. We have the tipping point. The world is now more urban than rural. We're starting to see an urbanization of poverty, which very much affects, a development agency such as ours. Still we know that there are more rural poor than urban, but increasingly the numbers are growing. We did, some analysis looking at, as I mentioned, looking at the economic crisis and the food crisis recently last year, and there's now some evidence that it was the urban poor that were hit the hardest. So these are the kinds of things that are kind of raising the issues, raising the profile. Also, some of the social issues, they're now on the agenda in the bank. Issues of crime and violence. We had food riots. We had some riots related to the economic downturn. Those are happening in cities. They're not happening in rural areas. So I think people are, saying, wow, we need to address this. And, for cities to be able to grow, they've got to have investments, and we need to be putting our money there. So, but it's it's always going to be a challenge. There's still lots of rural poor that need basic services as well. So, so I'm hoping it's deep, but we'll still see. I don't know.
I think it was directed at the bank, but I just want to say that UN Habitat is just one of 27 programs within the UN system. The degree to which the UN system has taken on urbanization is a question. the United Nations Development, what they call United Nations Development Country Frameworks, are adopted by UNDP and the Country Resident Coordinator System within all the countries in which the UN works. And one of the ways that UN Habitat tries to deal with that is that we're not a large agency, so we we entered into a cooperation agreement with UNDP and the Secretary General, where we have 54 what we call Habitat Program Managers. And these are nationals in these countries who are either urban planners or economists or folks that are involved in engineering and land management, who are based in UNDP offices and sit on the country team meetings every month. So it's a small way, but it's an attempt to try to mainstream this activity within all of the country offices. Without UN Habitat setting up country offices around the world, which would be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, it wouldn't be cost effective. We're not as large as UNICEF or UNDP. So I think there are a couple of indicators of change. I mentioned some of them before. The fact that we're a principal member of the Interagency Standing Committee. I think there are only 5 within the UN system. So out of the 27, the fact that they chose UN Habitat to be a member of the Interagency Standing Committee suggests that, at least within the humanitarian community, which is the lion's share of UN development assistance, mind you, I think it's 12 out of $15 billion a year is in humanitarian assistance. So the fact that they brought UN Habitat in there to deal with the urban question suggests that it's slowly permeating the system. And also, Mrs. Tibaijuka, the Executive Director of UN Habitat, is one of the members of the Chief Executive Board that is chaired by the Secretary General with the President of the World Bank, the IMF, and several Undersecretary Generals. And that's not an accident. I think they also realized that. And also, we were, up till 2000, Bob Buckley was talking about that before you had mentioned, in 76 when we were sort of first conceptualized. It was in 2001 that we moved from the Center for Human Settlements to the United Nations Human Settlements Program. So within UN structure, to move from a center to a program, it's like akin in a university to being a small committee or center to a full-fledged department of that university. It's a core activity. So there are, these are somewhat glacial moves, but there are some indications that the UN system as a whole has taken urbanization a lot more seriously. And I think the last response is that a lot of what happens in urban isn't called urban, but it's urban. The water and sanitation field has become increasingly urban, but people aren't running around calling it urban. The international NGOs associated with interaction, just to take one example, there are a lot of them that are working in urban areas, but they don't couch it as an urban program. So I think there is mainstreaming of urban that isn't called urban, which is another subset of this discussion that I think is important.
Thank you. I think there are 3 questions, and we'll take the questions and have respond to all 3 of them.
Hello, my name is Devin Brookins, and I'm from the Urban Institute. Both of you kind of touched in your presentations on urban governance. Judy specifically mentioned trade-offs and how do you make determinations for investments that kind of take into account equity and efficiency. And Chris mentioned this idea of vested interests and the idea that sustainability and climate change might be kind of pulling, and adaptation might be pulling for the same types of investments that are called for urban poverty and upgrading, which I think is kind of a fascinating concept. So the first thing that I thought of, well, what would be sort of an answer or response to this? And of course you would think participatory mechanisms or processes such as participatory budgeting. And I know that both the bank and Habitat seem to work quite a bit with organizations of the urban poor. But I was thinking or wondering, I guess, if there's kind of a mirror or something on the flip side of that coin in terms of associations or organizations of community groups that are maybe fighting processes that would potentially assist the urban poor. I think there was an article in the Times this week about the bus rapid transit program in South Africa. And it was talking about the difficulty of, household workers coming from Soweto going to Sandton and the upper northern suburbs of Johannesburg to do housework. And the communities in these kind of northern wealthier communities were kind of pushing back on the BRT system because they felt that this was bringing the poor into their areas. And so I think that this issue, not just having voice for the poor, but having kind of the counterpart so that you can have communities that are speaking to each other, that are part of the decision-making and the governance process, is something that's interesting. And I was wondering if either of you, of your organizations, and potentially CHF, because I know you do work in this area as well, are doing anything to that regard.
Okay. There's a question there? No. No? Alvin?
Question for both of the speakers mentioned thinking about the urbanization situation and challenge in terms of the linkages among urbanized areas or between urban and rural. So thinking of, if you think of that as a system, not thinking about the nodes, but thinking about the linkages. And I wonder whether any actual operations or programs operate that way, whether the strategies are conceived of that way, right? Invest here, invest there because they go in the same direction, or whether there are theoretical bases for the comments that you make, or any of those kind of categories. So.
Alvin, you had a question too.
Alvin Lam from HUD. It's not a question, maybe just a couple of comments. This is the last session of this Road to Rio workshops. And I think I want to add this, we should start thinking about the road beyond Rio. In Judy's second slides that mentioned about these paradigms, I think mentioned about the old paradigm is talking about how do we manage urban, and then the new paradigm is like we admit that urbanization is inevitable and we need to take a proactive action. That sounds like a little bit like a self-defeating about all our professionals over here. We couldn't manage it, so we accept that, and then we start thinking of doing something new. I think the going to Wharf, Chris mentioned this is going to be a very large U.S. delegation. HUD and other agencies and White House will be involved as well. So it is a great opportunity for all these political people, decision policy makers, to go to a conference and then to learn and to listen and then to share with others. So skepticism about conference, I think we have to see when they return, and then how do we actually follow up the conference. I think it's a great opportunity that we have such a good delegation, high-level folks going there. So the road beyond Rio is really up to us to how to continue the what we learned from there. We have the president is very committed to this. Political life is very short. I think we should all take this opportunity as well to engage with the policymakers that we thought we didn't make it in a while ago to manage our urban. Now maybe it's another opportunity we give a try. So I hope we can continue as a group in the U.S. Folks over here. We can gather something, put our resources together to committed to focus on urban issues. That's at least on my side. I will put in more resources to bring more resources to the urban issues.
Thank you, Alan. So two questions. One, urbanization, inclusiveness, and linking. Chris?
Yeah. I would really have to unpack your question of vested interests and trade-offs and sort of the community-to-community dialogue by city. I mean, South Africa is one context. Nairobi, Kabul. I mean, we're working in many different contexts. So I'd be hesitant to make a generalization. What comes across to me is just a central operating principle that the local governments are, in a sense, opening up to a level of dialogue where they don't see themselves as the be-all and end-all to urban planning and management. That, in other words, they're part of a larger process that includes multiple groups. The political realities on the ground to inclusion are a whole different story, again, by country. Nairobi slums are commercialized. They're syndicates. It's a very intense vested interest. Maintaining the status quo is the, that's the path of least resistance. And to fight that, to introduce more levels of inclusion, more voice, you're coming up against very powerful forces. And to try to anticipate those forces and, in a sense, bring them into the process is I think, a lot of what we have done for the last 10 years in a place like Nairobi, which is our headquarters, and we feel under some level of obligation to deal with very intractable issues, regardless of how politically sensitive they are. In other parts of the world, it may be less contentious, but still there are very different groups of people that have to reach some level of consensus on how to move forward. And understanding the political and economic processes that are in that particular city become paramount for any international organization that's trying to work there, as well as local NGOs and the people on the ground. So I think, and I'm responding to your question somewhat sideways, but I would want to pinpoint particular cities in order to address it. The case of South Africa, I think, is it's got a long political history of activism, not only with the anti-apartheid movement, but the role of civics and the decline of civics as ANC came to power. And that history is extremely important to understand why it is that different communities and the labor organizations and Katu, et cetera, are or are not talking to each other. So for me, it's more of a political analysis to the question. Now, concerning the question of the theoretical basis for urban-rural linkages and urban, I think Judy touched on it very well. If we're entering a stage of urbanization where the apex cities or primary cities are the ones that traditionally have had the widest growth, but they are sort of their growth is tapering off, meaning that the relative increase is less each year. They're still growing, but that acceleration is tuned down so that each annual growth is declining over time. And that the space of urbanization is being picked up by the secondary and tertiary towns and cities. There's very strong empirical evidence in a number of parts of the world to substantiate this, and it lends itself to theories of economic development that are not confined to the developing world, that have a long history. So I think that's a whole area of research. There's a lot about that in terms of the relationship between apex cities, secondary cities, and different regions. I think that has to be layered, though, in a lot of the countries we're working in, with the way in which the nation state was formed, coming out of the colonial period, and the kind of groups in certain regions that were privileged as opposed to others. In Uganda, for example, it was very much a north-south divide. The southern part of the country was in a privileged relationship in 1900 with the British government, where essentially it was the Baganda Kingdom and the British government that cut a deal on how to work together, and everybody else had to fit into that. And that caused tensions regionally. So the way cities grew in the north and the way they grew in the south was very much wrapped around that relationship. In the case of Kenya, Central Province is like a middle-income country relative to the rest of the country. That's Central Province around Nairobi. It's disproportionately wealthy because it's been in a privileged position in the colonial period and post-colonial period at the exclusion of other parts of the country. And that's a big part of the constitutional debates, and it also affects how urban growth works. So I don't want to be over. You're trying to touch on the theoretical basis. I think the area lies very much in a historical understanding of the political economy of those countries to begin to inform, how urbanization took place and why it took place and who sort of are winners and losers at this stage. But in terms of the rural-urban development, I think what's an interesting element, in addition to what I've said, is the innovation in technology. I mean, the mobile phone in sub-Saharan Africa is just an explosion. The ability for a person sitting in an informal settlement who's just made maybe $50 somehow to be able to put that on their mobile phone through what's called M-Pesa, Mobile Pesa, which is a Safaricom, which is a South African-based information technology service provider, mobile phone company. They've now basically created something outside of the conventional branch banking structure that allows money to be moved through the mobile phones in small amounts. So suddenly that money from an informal slum dweller living in an unplanned settlement, going not to necessarily what's happening in that city, but more to be remitted to a rural farming activity. I mean, we could spend hours analyzing that. But what I'm saying is that you've got a rural-urban linkage that's been accelerated by innovations in information technology that are changing the dynamics in terms of urban and rural relations in ways that have enormous implications for how we look at these issues. And there's a whole, Castells has written, a lot of theorists have written extensively on this issue. Information Age is a book written by Manuel Castells in 1998, I believe, that is quite a powerful articulation of this. And its application you can see empirically in a number of parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Chris. Judy, I'll give you a chance to respond, and then we can end.
Okay, I think Chris has certainly given a good context, and it was a great sort of summary of some of the literature out there and what we know. Maybe I can just respond very specifically more on an operational level. With the first comment about governance and vested interest, we certainly have a dialogue that exists with all of our investments and policy dialogue in a given country, that's open and, is done in some kind of participatory way. Admittedly, we, given the mandate of the bank, with, our mission statement is to reduce poverty, we tend to, I think, overemphasize trying to give the poor a voice, because historically they haven't had a voice. And I think the assumption is that, everybody else has an opportunity to, let their voice be heard. And so really a lot of our work is focused on that. So I can't think of concrete examples. But, again, a lot of our dialogue is quite open. And so people with vested interest do, make their voices heard. On the issue of urban-rural linkages, systems of cities, from an operational perspective, we do have some work that's going on. A lot of it, either it's at the policy level where we, engage at with the national level government on this kind of approach, and they make decisions about where investments go. And then more specifically, really in the transport sector is where a lot of our investments are happening. And it's about providing intercity linkages through, distribution networks, supply chains, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of work going on there. And some of that actually goes beyond country borders. I know, for example, in East Africa, we have, these regional transport projects which are linking cities across the that part of the continent. And I believe in East Asia there's something similar going on. So that would be much more specific.
Thank you very much. Let me take this opportunity to really appreciate Chris and Judy for being on the panel today. I thought with 2 speakers we'll be done by 4:30, but it's almost 5. And thank you for your patience. Thank you, all of you, for attending this session and the previous sessions. And I want to thank Woodrow Wilson, my colleagues from there, and Rockefeller Foundation for supporting this series. We look forward to more discussions like this, and we'll definitely be sharing with you the summary of our the 4 panels that we had, which we hope we should be done by mid-March. Thank you very much, and over to you, Brule.
Thank you. I want to thank Matthew and CHF and Rockefeller and my colleagues here, Allison and Lauren, Judy and Chris, the speakers, and all of you. This 4th seminar in this series has been somewhat star-crossed. It was scheduled for what turned out to be our snow days. That disrupted the profile of the speakers. It would have been, if it had taken place when it was supposed to take place, it would have been a very different panel. But I think one reason why we ended up using the amount of time that we had, despite the sort of changing roster of speakers, is this is a very actually important subject. How are major institutions responding to the changing environment in which urban seems to be becoming more visible? And I think it's been a very useful and very healthy discussion. When Judy put on her chart about the funding, and there was that sharp slope down throughout the 1990s, and it wasn't just in the World Bank, I think it was across the board. And that was, we set up this program at the Woodrow Wilson Center at the top of that, and we, over the life of this program, we've witnessed a dramatic fall off in interest. And indeed, much of what CUSP became about was simply trying to keep urban on the table. And now we're in a very heady situation. We see major international organizations understanding that urban is important. We see the U.S. administration probably being more pro-urban than it's ever been. We see the media, we see popular culture. An Oscar-winning movie is about some of these subjects. The front page of the Washington Post, I guess it was yesterday, was about megacities and earthquakes. Suddenly, people see connections they weren't seeing 10 or 15 years ago. But I think we also have to be very conscious that this is a challenge. This means that people actually are looking to folks like us in this room. And now, after all those years of sitting there saying the world is becoming urban, the world is becoming urban, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, it's time to actually show that we have some answers. And I think the question and answer period suggests that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because we're not used to being asked, quite frankly. The problems are huge. And underlying it, whether it's the rejection of climate change or the issues of inequality or a whole set of political challenges and conflicts, which are still there. And we're going to have to engage, and we're going to have to engage in an effective way. So the road after Rio is perhaps even more important. But having said that, I once participated, I very much remember a conversation right after the failed coup in the Soviet Union in 1991, in which a panel of specialists immediately jumped on how there would be no democratization in the Soviet Union because of all the internal problems. I think we should take a moment that is provided by the World Urban Forum and celebrate the fact that the trend lines are moving up again. And there is an opportunity for the people in this room and listening to us on the webcast to actually be heard. And we should welcome the challenge that we're being given a voice. Now we have to be sure we have something to say. So I want to thank all of you for participating in that. Matthew, I think very correctly points out this series will have an afterlife on the web, in publications, and we hope that it is a beginning and not an end. So thank you.
Thank you.